Hi, friends. You know what? Staying and focused in life is one of the main challenges I think we face. We can decide something with deep conviction. We can make a decision to do something or to try and live in a certain way, only to get distracted or tempted out of it. That's why staying focused, I believe, is truly one of the great challenges in life. It's important. I do recognize that it's important if we're going to accomplish anything in life in general, but particularly in our spiritual life, we need to have the ability to stay focused. Now, the added challenge in staying focused on the spiritual side of our life is that often, if we get distracted and focus on our worldly accomplishments, that can indeed take away the emphasis from the spiritual part of our lives. So I believe the doubly great challenge for believers is to stay focused on both aspects at the same time. But I do wonder, is that even possible? Well, I believe the Bible says that it is. Yes, it is, but it is a challenge, and sometimes it will indeed be difficult, but it can be done. And I state that because it's perfectly illustrated here in chapters 46 and 47 in the story of the life of Joseph and his father Jacob. So we're going to continue in this study by looking at what happened next in the story of Joseph, following this reunification of his family against the backdrop of the famine. Now, if you've been following along with us, you'll know that at this point we've reached the fact where there has been this catastrophic famine in the land of Egypt. Yet at the same time, Joseph has been elevated to the second highest political position, well, the highest political position in Egypt, but the second highest position of power and authority in the whole land of Egypt. Only Pharaoh has more power than him. And he is the one who has come up with the plan to deal with the famine, a plan to store food in the years of plenty in order that they can be prepared for the famine that is coming. Now, later now, when this famine has hit, it's not only hit Egypt hard, but it's hit the whole region, including Canaan. And that's where Joseph's family were. So the whole family now, following the reconciliation, have come down to Egypt, and they've been reunited after more than 20 years apart. And this is the story we've been looking at in a great deal of detail over the last weeks and months. But now we're reaching the closing verses of chapter 46. And I'd just like to open up this next study by looking at those two final verses of that chapter, which tells us, "Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's households, I will go and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him, my brother and my father's households who are living in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds and they tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own." Now let me just pause for a moment and mention the fact that Joseph, of course, has just been reconciled to his father, but now he's saying to his brothers, to the whole household, to the whole extended family for that matter, he's actually saying, okay, look, this is what's going to happen. I'm now going to go and see Pharaoh. I'm going to come and tell him that we've come from the land of Canaan and that you're shepherds. So he's going to tell Pharaoh that his family are here and that they're shepherds. But what is very important, he makes a point to say, I'm going to tell them that you are shepherds and that your occupation is to tend livestock, and you've brought your flocks and herds and all that you have with you. Now, that sounds the same thing, but there's an important underlying little fact going on here. So Joseph at this point is just announcing to his brothers, his extended family, what he's going to do. So he now coaches them what to say. So now look at verse 33. "When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, what is your occupation, you should answer, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood, just as our father did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the land of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians." So this is interesting. It appears a little bit conflicted, but it's interesting. He says, look, I'm going to go and see Pharaoh, And I'm going to tell them, I'm going to mention that you're shepherds, but I'm going to frame it within this overall context is that you are people who tend livestock. And he repeats himself. He says it once and then he says it to them as a way of coaching them. He's saying it like this is, I was trying to rehearse them for what they need to say when they're before Pharaoh. He says, you're ready? I'm going to have already talked to Pharaoh, but you're ready now so that when you go before him and when he asks you your occupation, you're to tell him that you tend livestock and that you've done that since you were young. But he's emphatic that they tell them, that they frame it that way, that they don't just say they're shepherds. He's downplaying the shepherd aspect and presenting them as owners and tenders of livestock in general, because as the text tells us, it appears the Egyptians would normally have an issue with shepherds. Next in the story is the presentation of the family to Pharaoh. So let's pick it up in chapter 47, verse 1, and let's see what actually happens and what they say when they do get before Pharaoh. So Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and everything they own have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen. And he chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. So clearly we're in the part of the passage where he has prepared them what to say, and that was at the tail end of chapter 46. But now at the beginning of chapter 47, he's going to present them to Pharaoh. He's told Pharaoh that they're from Canaan and they tend livestock and that they brought their herds with them. And he then goes back again, taking 5 brothers with him to present them to Pharaoh, who, remember, has already promised that he'll give them this part of the land, a great part of the land called Goshen. So verse 3 then tells us what happens. Pharaoh asked the brothers, what is your occupation? That's exactly what Joseph said he would do. And what did he do? He asked them what's their occupation. Let's see what they said back to Pharaoh. Picking up at verse 3. Your servants are shepherds. Oh dear. What were they meant to say? They replied to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, just as our fathers were. That, of course, means that they've just done this for generations, for a long time. They also said to him, we have come to live here for a while because the famine is severe in Canaan and your servants' flocks have no pastures. So now please let your servants settle in Goshen. Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your fathers and brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them who has a special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock. So when they get before Pharaoh, they explain that they just describe themselves as shepherds, and that they explain that they've come to Egypt was a necessity because of the famine being so bad in Canaan. Pharaoh's response, however, in spite of the idea of previously declaring that shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians, Pharaoh's response is overall completely favourable to them. Excuse me. Mainly, I suppose, because Joseph has saved the whole nation. He's no issue about them being shepherds. In fact, it appears he suggests that they can help in the future manage his own flocks and herds if there's any gifted in that way amongst them. So Pharaoh here is responding magnanimously to the great blessing that Joseph has brought upon him and his nation. And he says, all right, I'll give you some land. I'll give you this best part of the land. Granted, it's way at the other end of the country and it's away from most of the Egyptian people. But you can have it. Excuse me. You can have it, and if you've got some competent people in your family, I'm happy for you to put them in charge of my own flocks and herds. The story continues in verse 7. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out of his presence. Now we're getting to now to what I think is the most interesting part of the story. Up to this point, the whole focus has been on their needs to find food and the fact that they're going to need to find somewhere to settle, in this case, of course, Egypt. Joseph has been focused on that, and he obviously feels that he needs to make sure his family gets settled and provided for. That's been his initial focus. We've got to get them food, and we've got to make sure they're in a good place where their flocks can be settled, and that's been his whole the focus of his whole attention so far. Then suddenly we see Jacob himself come on the scene, and Jacob appears before Pharaoh. And look what he says, and look what happens in verse 10 I just read. It tells us that Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Now normally it would be the superior person who blesses the inferior person, but here is Pharaoh being seen to be blessed by Jacob. Now, I would like to suggest that this is a critical part of this story, because the rest of the chapter is just about how they settle the land in Goshen, and he makes the arrangements for the family to be secure and fed. But it is significant that twice in this passage it tells us that Jacob blesses Pharaoh. So even in the midst of this crisis, even in the midst of this emergency to get food and security for their families, it's clear that Jacob has not lost his spiritual focus. And I think that that is one of the critical verses in this passage. He didn't have to bless Pharaoh. Now, we don't exactly know what that meant, because the blessing itself isn't recorded, but we can assume that he probably prayed for Pharaoh and at least called for God's blessing in his life. But it is significant that this happened because it's stated twice in this part of the passage. So it's really worth thinking about this for a minute and thinking about what does it mean and why did it happen. Now, if you're reading the book of Genesis as a whole, like we are, and you hold this passage within the context of the entire book, then the giving of this blessing will recall in our mind the fact that way back in chapter 12, God said to Abraham, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless your offspring, which would initially be Isaac and Jacob, and I want you to be a blessing to the rest of the world. Now, it's obvious that within the book of Genesis and the Old Testament, all of the Old Testament, in fact, God is seen to choose the Jewish nation. But sometimes what gets missed in understanding this sovereign choice of God is the reason that God chose the Jews was in order that they could bless others. In fact, that God could bless the whole world through that nation. And of course, we discover the primary way he will do this is through the lineage of that nation, which will give us the Messiah, Jesus the Messiah, for the whole world, for all nations. So the whole seed plot of the Bible, here in the New Testament, and to a great extent in the New as well, is found in this blessing first given in Genesis chapter 12. God says, I'm going to bless you and your offspring, and you are to take that blessing and go and bless others. Now, Jacob here, who of course is in the direct line of Abraham and Isaac, and receives that blessing, is now seen here blessing others, maintaining his spiritual focus and his calling. And I would like to suggest that this too must always remain the focus of whatever faith we claim to have. We need to keep within our own faith lives the focus on remembering always to bless other people. God blesses us. You might say he only blesses us so that we can bless others. I would go so far as to say the minute you stop endeavoring to bless others, you will stop growing spiritually. Blessing other people is critical to our own spiritual life. Even in the middle of an emergency, like here, as a matter of fact, Jacob here talks about the fact that his whole life has been a great difficulty, but even within that conversation with Pharaoh, he still keeps a focus on his purpose, and that purpose was to bless others, and he's seen to offer that blessing to Pharaoh. So that tells me that we can do both of these things, all of these things at the same time. We can focus on the practical realities of life and the things we need to do and organize and plan in order to bring those practicalities to fruition, while at the same time focusing on the spiritual aspect of our life, focusing on the spiritually directed goals. We can do both of these things one at the same time. And I think really that's the true underlying point of this passage. That's what the message, the spiritual message contained within the story narrative is all about. So let's just pick up at verse 11 and continue with this narrative story. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt, and he gave them property in the best part of the land in the district of Ramesses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his fathers and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. So the focus now goes back on what he's got to provide practically for the physical needs of his family. That's perfectly legitimate, but sandwiched within this and in the midst of his concern for providing physically was this man, Jacob, who is still operating spiritually and indeed chooses to offer a blessing to Pharaoh. Now at this point I'm going to go off tangent for a little bit. I'm going to take a little bit of a segue. I don't normally notice that, but did you notice that in verse 7 it says, in the district of Ramesses? Now this short phrase that's existing here in this book of Genesis is a huge problem for some people. And as I explained recently, as and when I come up against things that appear to be conflicts or people will try and use as conflicts within the biblical text, I'll try and address them as we go along. So this short phrase here, in the district of Ramesses, does cause some people some problems. And let me explain why that is. In Exodus chapter 1, which is coming in about 3 or 4 chapters' time, but is describing events that take place 400 years later, after these events, the children of Israel then are said to be in the city of Ramesses. Now, liberal scholars who tend to like to shred the Bible of its meaning like to land on that verse in Exodus, and they say that because of the name of Ramesses mentioned here, the children of Egypt did not get out of Egypt until 1300 BC approximately. Some say, based on that one word, the use of that one word Ramesses in Exodus chapter 1, that the Israelites did not leave Egypt until 1300 BC. And here's their argument. Ramesses did not live until roughly 1300, so therefore the children of Israel must still be in Egypt at 1300. And this is based on the assumption that the city of Ramesses was named after a living pharaoh, which, by the way, isn't stated in the text that they're quoting. Now, on the other hand, if you follow the biblical chronology, mainly based on 1 Kings, then the Exodus event is seen to have taken place around 1446 or 1447 BC. And if you follow the biblical chronology, that's the conclusion you pretty much have to reach. So how do you answer the fact that Ramesses didn't live until nearly 50 years later, in approximately 1300 BC, and it appears that the city was named after him, by the way? Now, I know this all sounds a bit technical and so forth, but if you watch secular history documentaries and they ever mention the Exodus, they usually say it occurred around 1300 BC. And it's based on the one word, the use of the one word Ramesses appearing in Exodus chapter 1. Now, one answer to that is that there were other people called Ramesses at that time who had existed hundreds of years before that. And the city of Ramesses mentioned in Exodus chapter 1 was not necessarily named after the Pharaoh of 1300, because it's clear that that region already existed here, because it's mentioned in Genesis chapter 47 hundreds of years earlier. And on the other hand, Moses, who was writing these accounts 400 years after the events, could have been describing the area as it was named in his day, not how it was named then. So either way, it's irrelevant. So again, this is another case where there is a supposed contradiction in the Bible, or there is something, maybe it's more a case of saying there's something that is used to contradict the Bible and it needs to be answered, and I believe it is answered right here in the text. Okay, let's pick up the story at verse 13. There was no food in the whole region because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and in Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. Now we're going back again to this whole issue of the famine and the fact that there's no food. Now, if you recall, Joseph, he's second in command, and he's the one who's been put in charge of arranging the storing up of all the food during the good years. So he's selling the food to the people, and he's putting the money that he receives, all of it's going into the royal treasury. He's focusing on the job in hand. He's doing what he was supposed to do, and he's doing it, and you might really say that he's doing it well. 47:15 then tells us, when the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan was gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is all gone. So what the Egyptians are saying is, we've used up all our money to buy food, and now we don't have food and we don't have money because we've given it all to you. So now they're saying, give us food and give us it for free, maybe is their expectation. And Joseph said that, then it tells us in the text, this is Joseph's reply to that scenario. Then bring your livestock, Joseph said, and I will sell you food in exchange for your livestock, since your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, their sheep, their goats, their cattle, and their donkeys. And he brought them through that year with food in exchange for livestock. Now, this may seem a little bit harsh and profiteering out of this situation, but you've got to remember that these people had got to this situation by without his guidance, by choosing for probably generations now not to sacrifice in the present in order to create a secure future. Anyway, all right, they give him all their money, and now they hand over their livestock. And the whole issue in this chapter is Joseph has got to provide for the whole nation's and the regions beyond physical need. So we'll pick up the text and continue the story. When that year was over, they came to him the following year and said, we cannot hide from our Lord the fact that since our money is gone and our livestock belongs to you, there is nothing left for us, for our Lord, except our bodies and our land. Why should we perish before your eyes, we and our land as well? Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate. So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh, and the Egyptians one and all sold their field because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. However, he did not buy the land of the priests, because they received a regular allotment from Pharaoh and had food enough from the allotment Pharaoh gave them, and that is why they did not sell their land. Now, what's going on here on the surface can seem rather complicated, but really it's fairly straightforward. What he's doing here is he's state building. There has been a severe famine, so they've used all their money to buy the food, and when that's all gone, they sell their cattle. And then at this third stage, people sell themselves into bonded labour. Now, slavery, of course, today, for good reasons, has a very negative connotation, particularly as how we saw it used in recent history, and even into modern times, still today. But in the ancient world, this was a very common practice. This idea of going into bonded labour when times were hard was completely normal and very common. People also sold themselves to pay off debt, or in this case, to enable them to buy food. As a matter of fact, someone commenting on this passage said, there's not a whole lot of difference going on here, from a social point of view, than people today selling themselves to a company when they sign a contract to work for a single employer. In a sense, they're saying that you own me for the 40 hours of that week. Nowadays, we have, of course, many more freedoms about these sort of things and how they are arranged. But the point is that what's going on here is entirely normal in the ancient world. So they're giving everything they have in order to remain alive. And notice throughout this whole process, Joseph stays focused on doing the right job in the right way and putting all the money into Pharaoh's coffers. Oh, by the way, did I mention the priests didn't have to go through this? They're not required to sell the land. They were a privileged class. I'll come back to that in a moment. The text continues. Joseph said to the people, now that I have bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you, so you can plant the ground. But when the crops comes in, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you can keep for yourselves as seeds for the field and as for food for yourselves and your household and your children. You have saved our lives, they said. May we find favour in the eyes of our Lord, and we will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So Joseph gives them seed, enabling them to grow food, and he charges them a tax based on what they can grow. Now, some might say this is the first occasion of using a tax system to move people from being in a state of dependence into one of being independence, and such things are legitimate when it comes to tax. When a tax rate is applied in the correct way and is fair, it is a good thing. So what is a fair tax, you might ask? Well, the tax here is seen to be 20%, isn't it? And I think it's interesting that still today, most Western countries operate with an income tax rate that usually starts around 20%. I think that's fascinating. I also think it's really fascinating that business tax or corporation tax in most developed countries is set at around 20% as well. So anyway, here the tax is 20% of the crops grown from the seeds. This is interesting stuff, isn't it? Picking up the story in verse 26. So Joseph established a law concerning the land in Egypt, still in force today, that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. Now, when he's saying it's in force today, he's talking about 400 or 500 years later, when this has been written about the events 400 or 500 years previously. So it's still in force at that time that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. It was only the land of the priests that did not become Pharaoh's. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there, and they were fruitful and increased greatly in number. So this is simply telling us or showing us that he instituted a 20% tax rate, and it stayed that way for several hundred years after that. Also, what is really important to take out of here is that this issue with the priests shows the earliest example of the separation of the religious life from the civil state, that the idea of the worship of God does not get intermixed with the idea that God is embodied within any single state. At any rate, that's what happens, and during this process we see Joseph staying focused on his job, which was to save people. Ultimately, that was his role, to save people from starvation. And he didn't put any money in his own pocket by doing this. He put it all in the treasury of Pharaoh. Now, verse 27 says, in the meantime, the Israelites, that's the descendants of Jacob and Israel, lived in the land of Goshen and grew and multiplied numerically. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his sons Joseph and said to him, I have found favour in your eyes. Put your hand under my thigh, which is an ancient way of taking an oath, and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, Carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried, which would be Hebron, by the way. And I will do as you say, he said. That's Joseph speaking. Swear to me, he said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. So Jacob here, even as he's approaching the end of his life, he's focusing on the big picture. He's focusing on the spiritual things. He's focusing on the promises of God. Let me explain. God gave the land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, they're currently not in their land. They're currently in Egypt. But this indicates that Jacob believed that they, the nation that he was father of, would still one day inherit that land. So he says to his son Joseph, when I die, do not bury me here in Egypt, but when I die, take me back to Canaan and bury me there. And he specifically says, bury me with my forefathers. And if you go to Hebron even today, there is a tomb there which is said to be the tomb of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and several of their wives as well. So Jacob is still focused on the spiritual things. He's still believing the promises of God, the promise that he would give them the land of Palestine, later to be called Israel. And that's a story, of course, that we shall pick up in great length later as we work our way through the Bible. But in the meantime, let me simply point out that both Jacob and Joseph in this story were focused. Now, Joseph, by necessity, was focused on what he had to do. It was his job. It was his responsibility to deal with this immediate crisis situation of the famine. This was indeed a national, even a regional crisis. But throughout the story, his father, so Jacob gets on with that, but throughout the story, his father is constantly pictured as being focused on the spiritual side of what's going on here, of what's happening. He's seen to bless Pharaoh, offer the blessing of God to Pharaoh, but he still keeps in mind the promise of God that was given to his grandfather Abraham and Isaac his father, and he makes clear that he wants to be buried with them back in that promised land of what will become Israel. And that's what the passage is telling us. That's the main focus and purpose of this passage. That's the narrative of the events that are going on. But what's the point of it? What's the point? What are we meant to learn from this passage? Well, I think if you look at this passage as an entity, you have to conclude, and you particularly if you keep hold of and remember to place this passage within the context of the whole book of Genesis, that it's telling us that no matter what, the Lord will provide for his children. In this case, he uses a believer, he uses Joseph to provide not only for his people, the Israelites, but also for the Egyptians. And being Joseph, being the son of Jacob, he's following the pattern of God in that we have been blessed by him, and in understanding that, we are then to bless others. God, on the one hand, has provided for us, his children, but on the other hand, he has used them to bless other people. I think you could stamp this idea across the whole chapter and the whole book of Genesis as well. When times are tough, people are going to come to us, and we have the manna, we have the Logos, we have the Word of God, the comfort of God, which we can feed the people with, no matter what they're going through. But we also see in the life of Jacob was that he, when we look at them both together, Jacob and Joseph, we can see that there's no conflict between our need to focus on whatever our current responsibilities are, whilst at the same time focusing on our spiritual responsibilities. It's easy to focus and to get lost and just get our attention being grabbed by a current crisis and forget about the eternal things of God. It's very easy to get misled and focus on material things and forget about the spiritual. But this passage illustrates that these two men, Jacob and Joseph, they were able to focus on both. They had to focus on the present and the material, and he had to find a way. Jacob had to find a way in which he could get his family into a situation where they could survive and be fed. And Joseph had to focus on his role in ensuring the whole nation and region survived this crisis. They had to focus on the present and the material needs that they had, yet they still needed to remain a channel of blessing to other people, which is the spiritual side of life that they were commanded to stay in touch with and to stay involved with. So the important thing to learn is, notice they didn't lose sight of the eternal in the midst of their very present circumstances. There are many examples in scriptures, but it seems to me that Hebrews chapter 11 is the illustration of other people who did the same thing. So I think it's important to widen this out and just close by looking very quickly at one verse in Hebrews chapter 11. There's an old gospel song that says, "This world is not my home, I'm just passing through." I don't know if you've heard of it. I'm certainly not going to sing it because because that's not gonna sound great, to be honest. But what I am trying to say is that the sentiment of that song is true. It is, we need to get hold of the fact that we're just passing through this world, but we need to pay special attention to the fact that even though we're living in the material world, we can't lose focus on the spiritual realm and the promises of God. We need to stay focused on what's coming up, but at the same time not lose sight of the God opportunities around us. This world is not our home. We are just passing through, but while we are passing through, while we are living here, we will be given many God-given opportunities to be a blessing to someone else who is struggling. The very famous chapter in the New Testament of Hebrews chapter 11 has been referred to by many people as the great roll call of faith. It keeps going on and on about all these great heroes of the faith. In fact, it lists them, and we find them listed and given as examples one after the other. People like Noah are mentioned, Enoch, Abraham, Sarah, and then in verse 13 it tells us about these people. It makes this statement that says that all these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them far off. Let me read the text for you. Hebrews 11:13 to 16 says, "All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one." Now, it seems to me that these verses capture and capitalize on the very point I'm trying to draw out of this passage. The fact that they didn't receive the promises, the spiritual promises of the land in this life. Joseph didn't see it at this point. Jacob hasn't seen it, but they still didn't lose their focus. And at this point today, we see at the end of this chapter, Jacob, after all he's gone through, after all he's been through, he didn't lose his focus. He didn't lose his focus on being a blessing to other people, but keeping one eye on the future promises of God. So all these people, just these two, all these people in the Bible who died whilst living in faith, did not always see the promises that God had made to them fulfilled in their lives this side of eternity. They just glimpsed them far off in the future. They saw them through a glass darkly, it's described elsewhere, but still they believed them, they were assured of them, and they embraced those promises, and they lived their life in a way that showed they embraced them. They confessed, in a sense, that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth, and that they were waiting for something better, but they remained focused on their promise while still living in the everyday and helping people. Translated in short, I'd say they stayed focused. And that's what I believe what we need to do. But I submit to you that that's the real challenge we face as believers, is the challenge is to stay focused. We need to stay focused on what we need to do here in this life and be a blessing to other people while not losing focus of the eternal spiritual truth of our future spiritual home. Now, I believe if we're really honest, we would confess that we can so easily get distracted or caught up in the things of this world, the material things in the here and now, or we can even be overwhelmed by a crisis that we're experiencing in the present. But this passage, I believe, tells us that with God's help, we can keep our focus on spiritual things, the eternal things of God. And whilst we travel as pilgrims through this life, we can still be a blessing to others, whilst at the same time keeping our eye on the horizon of the future coming glory that awaits us.